All right, ladies and gentlemen, I know it's been a really, really impactful day. We've had lots of insightful discussions, and I'm going to shift the tone a little bit, to the way forward. And I'm so delighted to have with me here Eric Usher, head of UNEP Finance Initiative. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today and dialing in from London. How are you?
My pleasure, Jessica. Pleased to be with you all virtually, if not, I wish physically as well.
Thank you, Eric. As many of you who've been in this industry for a long time, you would know that the UNEP FI were one of the first global initiatives that put a sharp focus on sustainable finance. They launched in 1992, and I do remember that Akim Steiner, the UNDP Director General at that time in Singapore, I interviewed him as a young journalist, and I remember that he mentioned that the reason why UNEP FI launched was because he wanted environmentalists to speak the language of economists and for economists to speak the language of environmentalists. And, I was really inspired by the interview I had with him, and I subsequently actually then went on to launch EcoBusiness, and that has put, the team on this long journey. And I want to come back to UNEP FI, Eric, this topic of sustainable finance, when it started, was so fringe, and it was such a novel idea. And now we're looking at 10, 20, 30 decades on. Sustainable finance is finally coming into the mainstream. And the zeitgeist, like Eric mentioned earlier in the opening plenary, is strong. But there's so much more it needs to do, and it needs to go further. So given the backdrop of what we had discussed and the theme of the forum today being, disruption and the macroeconomic outlook being extremely uncertain, the market's very volatile, we're seeing the war and the energy security crisis. How do you think banks and investors can navigate the very pragmatic and real challenges that we face today?
Well, thanks very much, Jessica, and a pleasure to be with you. And it was actually good to listen in on part of the last session, and I think some of the major messaging, and I think certainly those in the room, I think, are highly committed and provide very important messages of leadership. But of course, to succeed, we need to also be getting others in the room. And how do we do that over time? Let me go back a couple of years to when the Paris Agreement, just before it was signed in 2015, we had at the time the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. He gave his speech at Lloyd's of London on the tragedy of Horizon. And at that point, the Paris Agreement, governments were trying to ink a deal around stabilizing global emissions, to stabilize the climate by end of century. And the tragedy he pointed out was that, unfortunately, end of century is not within the business cycle. And so it's too far off for the investment, for the financial and private sector community to be taking decisions, to be taking actions for a crisis that was at the end of the century. And of course, what we've seen now in the years since is, for better or for worse, that horizon has arrived much quicker than we would have thought in terms of the physical climate risks. We're seeing it every day around us. We're seeing the terrible flooding in Pakistan. Hurricane season is just whipping up now in the Caribbean. It's blasted through Puerto Rico, and we know we're almost getting immune to the headlines in the newspapers and the media about another climate impact on the other side of the world or closer to home. Of course, the horizon has also arrived in terms of transition risk, and we're starting to see governments putting in place policies. I would take internal combustion vehicles in the EU, in the UK, now in California. They've all set targets for either 2030 or 2035 that internal combustion engines will no longer, new ones, be allowed, new vehicles on the road. So the horizon is actually coming now into the business cycle, which basically means it's not about navigating challenges of tomorrow. It's about navigating the challenges of today. The work is now, and we are seeing a lot of progress, but the challenges are massive. I think we all understand that. And as Mark Carney himself said, somewhat simplistically, investing in renewables and divesting from coal, if I can mention just two sectors, that's almost the easy part. It's the other, the rest of the economy that we need to think about how do we fully decarbonize, how do we make it fully resilient to the climate change that is already happening. So certainly, if I can summarize some of the areas of progress, certainly since Paris, where the French government, through the G20, asked Mike Bloomberg to set up a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. How do you disclose on climate risk? Private sector provided recommendations voluntarily. There's been pretty good uptake. Most major corporates today do disclose on climate risks. And now the regulators have started to step up. New Zealand was the first, and now we've seen many more who are starting to say, look, we've had a good breadth of disclosures, but the depth is not sufficient. And therefore, we're going to now start to make these disclosures mandatory to try to provide better comparability, to more decision useful information. That's in climate. Meanwhile, most recently, we've seen that the approach there, efforts to replicate this through a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. So it's not only about climate. It's a wider set of sustainability issues we need to start paying attention to. And very importantly, at the Glasgow Summit last year, the launch of the IFRS, International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, which really will deeply embed the notion of disclosing essentially the impact that one's business has on the environment, on social issues. So it's not only the outside in, what does environmental degradation have on our business, but how does our business affect on the environment, on social, on these important issues. So we have moved, I think, really strengthened the mindset around understanding the risks, the impacts. I think the biggest step up today is the notion around alignment, because you really can't understand these issues properly on just looking at a transactional basis. We really need to understand not only the next green bond that we issue, but what about the rest of our bond portfolio? How green is it? How do we align with the race to zero, net zero on the climate side? Similarly for nature impacts. So we need those tools and the understanding deeply embedded within the corporate community, deeply embedded in investors and banks, about how do we understand how we align with societal's biggest challenges. What are the methodologies and the metrics to do that? That's really where I think the if I can use a crude term, the coal face really of sustainability challenges today.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think you've really been quite spot on some of the pressing issues facing the industry. We had actually quite a protracted debate around transition finance and how that has become really critical in hard-to-abate sectors. What do you see as the main challenge in getting, I suppose, the financial community and the business sectors as well to, I guess, understand the complex decision making that we have to do, and to kind of move the needle along on these very industrial sectors where, you know, the climate and the net zero transition is happening?
I mean, there's obviously a confluence of challenges here, and probably the biggest aspect is it is about the whole of the organization, and no one department. It's no longer sufficient to have a very good environmental risk or social risk management team. We essentially need to embed these issues, deep integration across every function of the organization. I was at a presentation recently from one of our major insurance members, and they were going through an organizational change process, and they actually commented that we found out that we actually have 600 people in an organization with sustainability in their title. It shows the breadth of where these issues are. They're in HR, they're in processes, they're in risk, they're in product development and innovation. And so I think it's particularly challenging today to figure out how do we line all of that up. And the reality is we've moved from what was largely a public relations issue to embedding it within risk to now a strategic issue, and one that once again cuts across everything, including issues of governance, compensation. So really, I think the biggest challenges are deeply embedding these issues. And it's the same in the economy. It's not only about the highest emitters, it's not only about the climate solutions, it's really almost every economic actor needs a plan about how they're going to transition. And these plans are not necessarily only about the well, there are solutions, but there are also many highly intensive energy, carbon intensive companies that we need to figure out how do we work with them, how do we help them transition, and the role of the financial community in working carrots and sticks in terms of engaging with companies, in terms of mobilizing the financing that's needed, and then ultimately potentially about divesting if they don't see that the company is actually going to survive in this transformation. A lot of difficult decisions, a lot of important new processes that will be required to enable such changes to happen.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I think, on this point of engaging with corporates, the next question I have really is on the relationship between regulators and the private sector. I think we've had, the conversations throughout the day about regulation and how that plays a key role in a framework, but then also this pushback that we can't expect the regulators to do everything, right? And so how are you seeing the relationship between regulators and private sector, and how can this be improved, enhanced, in the sustainable finance arena?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The relationship between the two is really key. We don't believe the solution is either voluntary or regulatory. We believe the solution is both, and essentially, we describe it a bit as a dance where you might know of the term from the Paris Agreement of the Paris ratchet, and the concept of the Paris ratchet is that governments put on the table what they are able to do, their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, and then you go around the table, and then over time you try to ratchet up each country's commitments. We believe the Paris ratchet also very much applies to the relationship between public and private. And so it's very, very important that you have effective signaling and essentially leaning in from the private sector to say, we don't know if the issue we're dealing with is going to get regulated. But what we do know is either we can solve it voluntarily, or if it's going to get regulated, it's in our interest to lean in and initially show how we believe it should be done. That's how the TCFD got going. Voluntarily, let the private sector show how they believe it should be done. Regulators will pay attention. And the reality is, regulating industry is very, very challenging and becoming more and more so. It's very hard for regulators to do things in a vacuum. They need to learn from the best efforts from the private sector. So let's get the private sector leaning in, and then regulators will decide whether they need to ratchet it up. And then over time, we get this Paris ratchet, or this signaling back and forth. And as we know, the private sector, what's most called for is certainty in the longer term. How can we get an idea? What sort of, let's say, prices they're going to be on carbon? What sort of rules are there going to be around land use management? If the government can give the intentionalities to say, we will bring in these new types of policies that will allow you to price, allow you to assess your risks effectively, then that's what really enables the private sector to move forward. So the relationship is critical. Obviously, in every region, in every country, that relationship is a little bit different. Who leads, on what basis, will always vary a little bit. But in terms of climate, particularly, where we really are seeing a global commonality of approach, and particularly with this race to zero, we are seeing very strong signals. Over 90% of global emissions are covered by governments who have now made a net zero commitment. We have, under the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which UNEP-FI is very involved with implementing, we have 450 financial institutions that have made commitments to net zero. Now it's about getting the job done. Now it's about implementing. And that implementation is going to be private sector action. It's going to be governments actually translating these net zero commitments into their NDCs, into policy action.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Eric. I love the idea of the ratchet, and it's a healthy peer pressure. I think that that's really driving things forward. I remember, a couple of years ago when Ecobusiness ran the story of the first Singapore bank that decided to announce that it would stop co-financing. In a short 11 days, all three banks then made that same commitment, and we're seeing that momentum, in the banking industry to make these pledges because their peers are making it, and so. I think it's healthy peer pressure, and that is something that we want to encourage. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll open up the discussion to the floor as well. We're talking about the way forward, the title of this closing fireside chat, and we've had so many discussions and insights about what we really need to do to move the needle. Would love to hear from you, from your perspective. Where do you think we should go?
I mean, I think to some extent, ESG and net zero and sustainability, they're they're in the headlines almost daily now. Now, not always in a good light. There's a lot of skepticism. There's a pushback. Some of it, I think, just and fair. Some of it maybe overly politicized. But I think the main message is this increased scrutiny is a sign of maturation. Just the fact that regulators are initiating investigations is a sign that they take this business very seriously now, which I don't think was the case 2, 3 years ago. It's the same on the political front. The fact that it's become a target of focus is because it's seen to be a significant movement, a significant force for change. So I do believe it's a sign of maturation, and it's also a warning that all actors, all economic actors, we need to be paying more and more attention to how we're doing things, how we're talking about what we're doing, the metrics we're using. They need to be credible. They need to be science-based. As long as you have an investment strategy which is defensible, then I think the scrutiny will help in terms of mobilizing more ability to actually deeply integrate, as I mentioned earlier, this into financial practice. And we really feel that real change is not simple. It's not easy, and this is really what we're on the precipice of. When we have major economic actors who are starting to send the signals that essentially we need to decarbonize. This is an economic reality. It's an environmental and social reality. Then this is when change happens. And I think we're really we're there, or we're very close.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask if anyone in the room has any questions for Eric here. Lots of reflections today. Anyone wants to? No, I'm surprised. I think everyone is kind of like, as Federico said, their head is exploding from all the information that we've been digesting. But Eric, just while I let the audience have a bit of a reflection, I want to pick up what you said about the politicization of ESG. And I think, we've had that thread running through the whole day about how this issue has been hijacked by some quarters to throw skepticism, to throw doubt. And then we've had that chat about how data and the need for transparency and scrutiny is helping the ESG investing movement, because when we have data, we can make better decisions. Do you feel that, the conversation we're having is constructive enough? Do we feel that ESG, being sieged by accusations of greenwashing, of being political, of being woke, whether this really is even a constructive debate that we should be having?
I think it's definitely useful to have the debate. Obviously, it has to be grounded in reality. And as we know, one of the challenges today is the way we communicate, through the Twitter sphere and otherwise. Reality is often, what ends up on the cutting floor, and it's more about reinforcing people's beliefs one way or the other. And so I think part of the question is, how can we turn pushback into a concrete assessment of where credible action lies? And certainly if we talk about net zero, there's plenty to chew on, if I can say, in terms of what needs to be done. And we I think many actors, including ourselves, see that if you really want to seriously move forward on net zero, you set high level targets, but the reality is you have to get into a sectoral level. We have to understand every industry that's high emitting today, and what are the transition pathways to actually decarbonize. So you need to look at transport sector, the energy, agriculture, steel, cement, the food system. And I think once you break it down and you actually say, what is the pathway, let's say, to get the steel sector to fully decarbonize, what are the technological innovations that will be needed? What are the policies? It becomes a more concrete discussion. And I think it kind of gets away from this fuzziness, this wokeism, which is very easy to refer to. The reality is people who are using the term are very far away from the actual issues involved. And essentially they're using it mostly because they're trying to communicate some other type of message, political or otherwise. Not so concrete, not so useful. So we need to think about how do we communicate in more, I think, concrete ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really like what you say about using the pushback as a lever for change, and I think that we can all relate to that. Thomas, you have a question? Yeah.
So a little bit of a left field question, but today, our friends from the Philippines talked about the fact that they are at the wrong side of this, so they don't really contribute to the problems we're having globally in a meaningful way, but they certainly get the bad side of the stick. Africa is a really good example of that. This year we have COP27 in Sharm, and I hope that some of that is going to be Africa. Have you got any thoughts about where Africa fits into this? And because they're not being heard much in the public debate, and at least my hope would be that COP27 would give something to the countries that are not being heard, but perhaps I'm being too naive.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think there are, hopes that COP27 will focus a lot on both Africa and also the resilience and the adaptation objective, and the reality that it typically gets short shrift compared to mitigation and carbon, and we know addressing climate is about much more than just mitigating carbon. There's all work around building resilience and nature-based solutions, which often actually come together much more effectively. So absolutely agreed. There will be, I think, on the challenging side, issues around loss and damage. There are some issues where the parties clearly are not fully agreed, and we hope that progress will be made. We within UNEP FI, we're working in various ways. We've just launched this year through the V20, which is the vulnerable 20 countries, which Philippines is also a member, a new facility called the Sustainable Insurance Facility to work with global insurers to try to develop new types of risk management solutions to support essentially climate resilience within the most vulnerable countries. That is the role of the private sector, the insurance industry. What can they do? Of course, they can't do it all. The public sector needs to be more. The new what was called the Copenhagen 100 billion commitment from the Copenhagen COP. Now they are negotiating the new commitment. What will it be in terms of support from developed and developing countries? And that's also heated. It's not decided, but progress needs to be made there in terms of public finance. So there are many issues at stake. I don't think they're all going to get solved in Sharm el-Sheikh, but we really hope that there will be progress.
Thank you, Eric. We have a question coming in from our virtual participants, and then I'll come to you. This question is ESG too big and broad as an umbrella term? Would it be better to focus on the E, the S, and the G separately? And I know where this comes from, because if all of you remember, like a month ago, The Economist ran a cover story about the E in ESG being the only relevant ESG term. And I think that some people also feel perhaps that when businesses pursue the E, they actually suffer on the S, because in that transition, livelihoods are affected, and obviously the economic impact is there. So, Eric, we'd love to hear your perspective on that.
I love The Economist, but on this one, I think unfortunately the article, if you read the article, it basically calls for more or less, improving the concept of ESG. And yet the cover did not convey that. And I think that's just one example of mainstream media doing a little bit of clickbait type sensationalized messaging, and where we need to mature this. And I think we all agree that, particularly around ratings, the ESG does need improvements, very serious improvements. Now, let's remember that, it was 500 years ago that there was an Italian monk who drafted the first set of what became modern accounting standards. 500 years. Now, ESG has been around for about 15 years. We have a lot of work to do to get it right. Can you, the issue of, are we focusing too much on carbon or on the E versus the S? I think depending on the frame that you take, all of these issues are relevant. And obviously the job of investors, of private actors, is to try to understand the scope of what's relevant to the business that they are operating in. What are the impacts, and what are the mitigating actions to be taken? I do believe we've moved to the the period of impact. That is just, it is not responsible business to have an activity that creates impact, social or environmental. It's not responsible to be doing that without understanding what those impacts are. So in the financial sector, it's a little bit around, the purpose of finance. If you don't understand your purpose, what exactly you are financing, what activities, what jobs, what benefits, what impacts, negative carbon emissions, etc. If you don't understand the purpose of what you do, then you are most likely to actually get into trouble. And this is what we saw in the global financial crisis. What was clear, most actors didn't actually understand what they were financing. And then when it came out what it was obvious that it didn't make sense. But at the time, they didn't have the systems in place to properly monitor and understand essentially purpose. And so I do believe a sense of purpose means understanding all the E, S, and G, but then of course focusing in the areas where you have the ability to make the most change.
Thanks, Eric. You raised some really salient points here. And as a founder of Eco Business, I'd like to encourage everyone to maybe change your subscription from The Economist to Eco Business. It's free, doesn't cost anything. You just have to sign up with your email. But anyway, jokes aside, we have a question there.
Yes. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Jess. I was going to say that we are eco-business and we don't do clickbait journalism. But I am from the Philippines. I had eco-business in the country. And you probably caught our president speaking at the UNGA and asking for the rich countries to keep true to their pledges to pay for loss and damages without weakening our stance on that. I think that as a Filipino, I'd like to introduce a different narrative this time, not just to keep asking and asking and asking. How do you think we could constructively engage with the rich countries to really keep true to their commitments and help us build climate adaptation and resilience?
Thank you, Ping.
Yeah, I think obviously it has to be a partnership for change. And I think, progress, be it on environmental, social, economic measures, is something that is not narrow, but it's broad. It affects everyone. And therefore, I think the relationship between developing countries, emerging markets, how do we work together to create that? It's very hard, as we know, for a private actor to actually create change on their own. They rely on a policy environment. They rely on a relationship with the customers, with civil society, with their employees. And I think here in a similar way, the relationship between developing between global multinationals and local business is a very key one, that we need a relationship that creates prosperity for all actors involved. And once again, if we're doing it at the cost of one specific constituency, eventually over time that will come back and impact every actor involved. So we need to get better. I think that the metrics are very important. The data is very key to understand the impacts of the business that we're doing, or the business relationships that we're having. What we don't need is making improvements in one place just because we're actually shifting the emissions to another place. We need a holistic approach of how we understand that. We hope that the climate process will make progress in that direction. We're quite optimistic, and maybe that's our role in the power of the private sector to be able to create economic prosperity, which affects all in a positive light, in a positive way. And we believe the relationship between public and private has improved in recent years. The geopolitics have gotten more confusing, but I think within the realm of climate, at least, we still see a fairly positive supporting, even geopolitical relationship between the major powers. And so we remain optimistic, and we continue to see the very important role that the private sector can play to help cultivate this environment for change.
Thank you for that. I think we had a question. Robin?
Hi, thanks very much, Eric. It's actually a comment, really, about the private sector and what you're saying about criticisms of ESG investing. I think some of the most credible criticisms of ESG have come from the private sector. For example, the former head of sustainable finance at BlackRock that came out saying some very critical things about ESG. Also, the incumbent head of sustainability at HSBC also said some critical things about ESG. And also, obviously, Deutsche Bank, the offices were raided in Frankfurt over allegations of mislabeling investments. So I think those criticisms, right, to me at least, are the most credible from people that are actually in the business of sustainable investment, calling it out. So wanted to put that to you and ask you what you say in your conversations with these banks about managing their investments.
Yeah, I think, as you said, these are all very important pushbacks, if we can call it that. And I think it's very important for companies to have, whistleblower and other programs that allow individuals to come forward when they see what they believe is wrongdoing. So that's a very, very important process, which the UN, highly values. I think in terms of the criticism that has been made, part of it, and we don't have a position on any one of these individual cases, others to say that everybody's paying more attention now. The fact that regulators, as I mentioned earlier, have initiated cases like the SEC in the US, the fact that they're paying attention to this space is an incredible change. Same for BaFin in Germany, same for the UK advertising regulator. So everybody's paying more attention. I think the only criticism I would call out a little bit is Tarek Fancy, who is the one at BlackRock. His position is whatever the private sector does voluntarily doesn't help. It makes things worse. It's only when regulators regulate that the problem will be solved. And I think he misses the reality that regulators have a very hard time regulating unless they see the private sector starting, at least leaders in the private sector, starting to move in this direction, and they can start to learn from it. Because frankly, these are difficult industries to understand as an insider, but as an outsider, as a regulator, to essentially understand the dynamics involved is incredibly complicated. And case in point, I mentioned GFANZ earlier. They're putting out some very important guidance. They put out guidance on issues like portfolio alignment metrics. Essentially, can we talk about a 2-degree or a 1.5-degree portfolio? The methodologies involved are so complex, and we believe it's very, very useful for the private sector to start to do it and then start to communicate, what are the different ways in which you can do this type of approach, because regulators will really take positive signals from that and they'll start to act. And for instance, the ECB, European Central Bank, has started to set supervisory expectations on European banks about the management of climate risk. They're partially doing it. I think they're responding to actions that the banks have started to take. The role of the regulator really is to ratchet up and to create like-for-like comparisons and a basis to actually probably understand how we can ratchet forward. And I don't believe it's something is that everybody can just sit back and wait to be told to do it. That I think we'll be waiting for a long time. We have been waiting for a long time. It's only really, I think, since the private sector has really started to lean in, that we're seeing also some very positive developments on the regulatory side.
Thanks so much, Eric, for that really comprehensive answer. We have a follow-up question on our Q&A, and that is that Stuart Kirk, I think that's the HSBC former head, started a new movement questioning the purpose of responsible investing. Do you think this helps or hurts the momentum?
Well, I think sadly, Stuart does reflect within large financial institutions, including banks, a lot of people are still not convinced. And therefore, the views he's expressed might not be that different from typical views, not of everyone, but of many people within these big organizations, which is a sign that obviously, there are misalignments. We don't have clear sense of purpose with these organizations. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I would question the position and mandate he had within HSBC to lead on responsible investment. Clearly, there was some sort of failure there. And I think HSBC came to that realization, and he's no longer in that position. So his views might be commonly held, but how you change an organization is definitely not with those types of views. I think on the positive side, one of the most significant changes we're seeing today is those who are engaged within the organizations. It used to be a handful of CEOs who've played a very important leadership role, but we know it takes more than leadership in terms of, good speeches, good letters. It takes implementation, and that requires senior management, not only the CEOs. And that's the change we're seeing today. It's the C-suite, the chief risk officers, the chief investment officers. They're taking ownership of these topics. And we're seeing that particularly within the net zero work that we manage 3 of the GFANZ alliances, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Asset Owner Alliance, and the Insurance Alliance. And the governance bodies are peopled with those leading on the operational side within the organizations. The sustainability teams are certainly very involved and very important. But as we know, it's when the operational side gets involved, that's when the organization starts to implement. And so now that's still fairly recent. And so really the last year or two that we're seeing that change. But I think that's very hopeful. And I would hope that those are the people who will change the views that the Stuart Kirk's comments, we hope, obviously need to change. And so I think that is coming. And Mark Carney through GFANZ has put together, the leadership from the global financial industry. And these people, they are very involved. When they're in these meetings, the global CEOs, they actually don't use speaking notes. They are speaking because they know these topics. They're dealing with them now on a regular basis. And so I hope the Stuart Kirk comments, it's something to be dealt with, something to be addressed, but we're hoping that over time that actually will start to go down as we start to get a broader, better sense of purpose across these organizations.
I think that was very well put, Eric. He probably hurt quite a lot of feelings calling people a nut job, which, as you know, it doesn't go down very well with the community. But any final questions in the room before I wrap up this closing fireside chat? This is your last opportunity. No, in which case then my final question for you, Eric, really is that, we've had, a day of amazing conversations, hundreds of people being involved, and a lot of, business leaders here. If you had one ask of Asian CEOs in this region, what would that be?
I think, Jessica, we need to think about how do we accelerate the evolution from ESG or sustainability as largely a public relations or a CSR topic, that must be really firmly embedded within risk processes. And as I've mentioned, we are seeing a lot of progress there. But then we need to go further, and we really need to figure out how do we make it fully strategic. So with cutting across the entirety of the organization. Now this is a journey, and I think it's as we know, any journey, we need a map. And so I think, it's not to say that the expectations are that you do everything today, but we do believe it makes a really important sense to start mapping that journey and then progress that we need to make over time. And it's only, as we know with any strategic issue for the business, it's only if you embed it, from the governance, the processes, the compensation, all departments, it's only when everybody has a role to play, then we actually, have a strategy to really accelerate to get to where we want to go. So I think my ask is map that journey, because it's going to be a complicated one. It's going to be challenging. There are very significant risks to bear, but there's also very significant opportunity. And without knowing where you're going, it's quite unlikely that you're actually going to get there.
Thank you, Eric. I think the 3 words really that, I take away from this really insightful fireside chat is embed in an organization, to evolve your corporate journey as well as your policy journey. And then the third, which is really key, is implementation. And this is actually the theme of COP27 that we're going to see in Sharm. So please join me to thank Eric for such an insightful and deep discussion on sustainable finance. Eric, thank you so much for dialing in from London. All the best to the rest of the day, and we will be in touch again. Thank you.
My pleasure, Jessica. Thank you very much.
Thank you.